Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. The program will begin shortly.
Welcome back. How are we doing? That was a lot, huh? Very interactive. Come, please take your seats. Welcome back. So we're experimenting. We're trying to do new things. So we're looking forward to getting your feedback on how the workshops went, how the Ed Chats, the podcasts, all of that. So if you're back and you've checked in on your app, you'll know that you're now in for a real treat. I have Dennis Shirley's bio, so I know him, so it's kind of hard for me to do this sort of in a formal way. But Dennis Shirley is professor of education at the Lynch School of Education at Boston College. You might notice there's a tie between an earlier speaker. Dennis dedicates his life to the improvement of teaching and learning for students so that they may flourish wherever they may be. He is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Educational Change. He's an indispensable resource for change leaders at the school, state, or national levels. I'd like to add international level as well. He was a visiting fellow with EI last summer and spent some time with us and our staff thinking through the new imperatives, which led to his. Well, he's been with us many times. He's conducted research and led professional development workshops for school leaders in 6 continents, and his work has been translated into many languages. He actually speaks many languages, too, including Latin, I believe. No. Italian is the new one, right? Most recently, he's authored a 2nd edition of The Mindful Teacher. He really appreciated Andy's comments earlier. And his newest book is entitled The New Imperatives of Educational Change, Achievement with Integrity. And as you can tell, that's the theme that we're moving into now. So I'd just like to say, Dennis is also one of these wanderers, fellow travelers, who likes to go on long walks with mindful and thoughtful leaders. And we're really glad he does. And he's, like many of you, but Dennis recently has made a lot of sacrifice to be with EI. He just spoke to our executive board. He spoke to our OECD affiliates conference. And I think you'll agree with me that he is one of the most inspiring speakers that we will ever have, I think, because he gets down to the very purpose of why we teach, from a very human basis. I think every time I've walked away after a Dennis Shirley presentation, I felt not smarter, but wiser. And I think we often talk of ourselves as they try to talk about us as the knowledge workers, but we really want to be as the wisdom workers. And Dennis pushes our thinking in terms of around that moral purpose, around that integrity, around that really core identity of who we are. And so please join me in welcoming Dennis Shirley.
Thank you, David. You're the best. You are. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm going to try and be super animated because I know that many of you are jet lagged, right? And it's a little bit hard at 4 in the afternoon. So this is the subject for the remarks this afternoon, educating for integrity, leading our profession as an existential imperative, as something that we must do, something that everything else depends on. How do we do that now in this current context? So I've divided it up into the familiar trinity. The structure of the presentation is as follows. First, how can we understand the relationship between achievement and integrity? In many contexts, we've got very, very good at pushing achievement scores up. We know how to do that, but sometimes it might feel like the integrity is being left behind. So I want to spend a few minutes on that relationship. And then I want to think that out of that discussion, we can deduce some guidelines for action, some things that we must do. If we didn't need to do them before Brexit or before Trump, we really need to do them now. We need to think very seriously about the kind of future that we want to bequeath to the rising generations. And then finally, if we can we find some promise in this present moment? So we've been through a data-driven age. We've been through an achievement-obsessed age. Now we're starting to transition into a new time where there's increasing concerns around well-being and identity. But maybe there's something even beyond that. Maybe there's a new phase of meaning and purpose. And that might be the promise of the present moment, that we take ourselves more seriously, that we're more engaged with our students than ever, and that we really reach out to the parents and the communities while mindfully attending to our core values. And maybe I would just say, if you look up the word mindful online, it's very interesting. And the way that I use the term is in some of the definitions that come to us from Sanskrit. It actually has a lot to do with remembering. It has to do with remembering your core values. What is it that you care the most deeply about? And how will we nurture those values? Because there's a lot that goes on in our world that will distract us from our core values. And just a little bit of an autobiographical story there. I was at one point in my life where I was managing big federal grants in the US, and then it all kind of came to a close. I did something I probably shouldn't have done, which I signed a petition along with other educators protesting the war on Iraq. And I said, we really need that money for our schools and for our communities. And in the time of George W. Bush, if you signed that kind of a petition protesting, your chances for federal funding were not really great. So I thought a lot about what I was doing, and I thought about the work that was going on in the schools, and I tried to get back to my core values. And that, I think, is really the call of whether you call it mindfulness, whether you call it discernment, whether you call it being a caring educator. That is something that I think is a challenge which stays with us throughout our lives, no matter where we are, no matter what we're teaching, because there are so many alluring distractions. So how can we capitalize on that present moment? Now, I'm going to speak fairly briskly here, trusting that the translators are able to keep up with me. Are you guys okay back in the translation booth? Yep, okay, very good. That's great. So how do we understand this relationship between achievement and integrity? Well, one of the ways that we can do this is by starting with what integrity is not. So in the US and other systems where we've been putting enormous pressures on educators to get their test score results up, we've had an epidemic of schools and school systems in which not the children, but the teachers and the administrators were caught cheating and manipulating student test scores. Why is that? Why is that a new phenomenon? Is it the individual educators in that system, or is it something that the system is doing to them? This is not just a US-based phenomenon. China has also had this problem with cheating on its student rankings systems, and we've also seen examples of this in British schools and universities in recent years. So why is this? What's happening? Now, for many years, in many sectors in the business community, there was a lot of research about how important goals are for your organization. And the idea was that you should have what were called BHAG goals, big, hairy, and audacious goals. And you should set these enormous goals, and then you should put people under incredible pressure to get those results for those goals. But there's a report that I recommend to all of you. It's called Goals Gone Wild. Not Girls Gone Wild. Don't go to that website. I did not say that to you. I said Goals Gone Wild. Translators, don't let me down, okay? The systematic side effects of over-prescribing goal setting. Really encourage you to read this article if you're in a system where there's a lot of pressure on your educators, because what it basically says is when you set these BHAG goals for your system, people feel under so much pressure that they start gaming the system. And it's not epiphenomenal. It's not something that just happens every now and then. It's systemic. And then we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing? We are in a moment of organizational alienation from the purposes of schooling when we start putting so much pressure on people. So I read that piece, and that led me into deeper reflections on, well, what is the nature of achievement? What do we really hope for our young people? What do we imagine? What is the nature of the challenges that face us on our fragile planet today? And how can we make sure that we're raising a rising generation that is looking forward with confidence and zest to resolving these problems? How can we do those things? Well, we can't do them if we just focus on achievement as student test score results, because there's so many kinds of knowledge and so many kinds of skills that we need that go beyond how well students do on their test score results. Francesca, are you here? I have a colleague from Rome. I was teaching in Venice in the fall, and Italy has a long tradition of oral examinations of students, forma interrogazione. And I asked my students, how old is this tradition? And they said, about 2,000 years. I said, really? Where did it come from? Cicero? So in Italy, they have a tradition that goes back for over 2,000 years on oral examination. Why did it matter so much? Because if you want to live in a republic, Cicero said, then you have to know how to debate. You have to know how to marshal ideas. You have to know how to present them with persuasive force. So there's lots of ways to think about achievement, including oral presentations, excellence in sports, the arts, hiking in nature, whatever you may seek to pursue, there's lots of ways in which human beings can excel. Now so that's the second form of achievement, the pursuit of a worthy goal. And one of the schools that's I've had the pleasure of studying in Singapore is Assumption Pathways School, where they work with all young people who have struggled in their own academic careers to come up with their own goals. So if you're petrified of singing, you try out for the school musical. If you're afraid of heights, you start rock climbing classes. You can establish your own goals, and these can be good goals to help peers who are struggling with substance abuse problems and so forth. So that's another definition of achievement. And then a third one, and the one that I think we need to be most concerned with in education today, is achievement as a result of a school system. What do our school systems do in terms of the definitions of achievement? How do we define achievement for our young people? What do we say is a worthwhile achievement, and what is not a worthwhile form of achievement? The teachers that I worked with in Boston on the Mindful Teacher Project experienced so much alienation in their system. And there was one teacher who was working on a project on the civil rights movement, and her principal said to her, well, that's okay, as long as your test score results go up, right? That's alienated teaching. So how can we come up with achievement in a way that we can construct more mindfully, with greater discernment? So these are questions I think we need to ask ourselves, and then we need to ask ourselves, what is integrity? Okay? What is integrity? Is integrity a personal characteristic? So we often say integrity is a person who exemplifies what they say and what they do are integrated. Can we think of integrity as a professional disposition? So there's some research on teaching which is a bit discouraging in that teachers will see other teachers treating students badly but won't say anything. Because what kind of professional culture do we have where we hold each other accountable for treating students well? And then finally, integrity as a result of a school system. Does the whole school system help the educators to do their personal best, to flourish, help those educators to take care of themselves so they don't come to school burned out and angry and take it out on the kids? What does the school system do to encourage the educators to reflect on their core moral values and then to seek to enact them? Can we put these things together then? Can we put together achievement in a broad humanistic sense in school systems and integrity so that we don't have alienated learning, alienated teaching, we have mindful and integrated teaching and learning? Can we do those things? Well, we can't do them if we put together systems that continuously produce low achievement and low integrity. And that's what we've done for many years in my own country. I do love my country. I love the United States. It's got so many great things that's going for it. But in our school system, we've put tremendous pressure on educators in our schools that are struggling the most. And we give them very, very high standards. And if they don't get the results up, then we close the school, we fire the principal, we make the teachers reapply for the jobs, and this has not worked. If you just look at our PISA scores, whatever you think of PISA scores, they have not improved in the different administrations of the test. Now, you can sometimes get high achievement and low integrity, and here's how you do it. We know this pretty well. You get bright young students out of the top liberal arts colleges. You give them 6-week summer institutes. You throw them into the classroom. You have them work 80-hour work weeks. They're totally exhausted. They're not married. They do it for 3 to 5 years, and then they leave because they want to get a life back. And you can do that. You can do that for a few years, right? It's a very cynical approach to school reform. It's totally deprofessionalized. It perfects unsustainable educational change. It perfects it. So if you want to have that as your goal, then pursue that model. Or you can have the model of low achievement and high integrity, so you get an educator in who's a minister from a local church, also a certified teacher, and you say, look, we don't know what else to do with our struggling school here. You seem to have 400 folks from your neighborhood who are going to your church. Come on in and lead our school. And then you bring in the principal. I studied this school. And the principal, his solution to everything is love. Love the children, love the teachers, love the parents. I called him Dr. Love. He had indiscriminate love for everybody and everything all the time. The one thing he didn't have was any strategy for improving learning. And when I talked to the teachers in the school, I said, how do you guys learn from each other? They say, actually, we don't do that. It's the principal who comes in and assesses us. And he's in our classrooms all the time, so you're not developing any collective capacity with that model. Now, you can also get high achievement and high integrity. How do you do that? So one of my former students, Andy Bott, became the principal of Orchard Gardens Elementary School, well, actually kindergarten through 8th grade school in Boston, and he came into a school that was known as a principal killer. It had had 6 principals in 6 years, right? Kids were always out of control. There was violence in the school. It served a large inner city population. And Andy Bach comes in and he looks at the situation. He says, we got to do something to shift this whole culture. So what he does is he looks at the salaries of all the security guards in the school and he fires them. Every single one, they're fired. Then he does a national search for the best art and music teachers he can find in the whole United States. And he brings those art and music teachers into the school, and when a student misbehaves, they're given a saxophone or a paintbrush, and they're told, express with this instrument or with this paintbrush what you're feeling inside. And then artwork is put up all over the school, and if a student is caught doing anything well, you give them a shout out over the school intercom system. And what do you know? The achievement results made that school one of the most rapidly improving schools in Massachusetts. But it doesn't just have to be a US example. At the Robert Bosch Gesamtschule, or comprehensive school in Hildesheim, Germany, they were struggling. Low student enrollments, low staff morale. They decided to come up with their own protocol for visiting each other's classrooms and giving each other feedback. And they turned into one of the most improving schools in Nordrhein-Westfalen in Germany. So there's lots of different ways that we can get to high achievement and do it with integrity. But we'll have to think strategically about how we do that. It won't be easy, it'll be hard. There'll be lots of problems on our path to optimizing achievement with integrity, because we've got lots of roadblocks that we've put in the way of our educators. And the first one is our ideologies. So I was just at a session with some Latin American colleagues, and they are experiencing the brunt of the neoliberal onslaught of new public management in their continent, right? Here come the markets. Here comes the managerial language. Here comes the disruptions of the professional associations. Here comes one model of parent engagement, which is choice. It's not participation. It's not democratic. It's choice. You get to choose the school, right? And then if you've got enough funding, then you can, ratchet it up just one little bit so that you can get into a school that's not a traditional public school, it's also not an elite private school. So our ideologies have made it very, very hard for us to do the best that we can do. And then this has been driven by certain imperial imperatives, ideas coming mostly from the United States and from England that are pushed out onto the world with a variety of political manipulation that guides that through the World Bank and other transnational aid organizations. That's made these ideas susceptible to policymakers integrating them into their context. Even if you're in wonderful social democratic Norway, it's coming in. Certainly if you're in Latin America, if you're in Southeast Asia, those things have gotten in the way of our change. And we've looked at our educators as people who need to be given orders, and we've micromanaged them through prescriptive interventions. Meanwhile, in countries like the United States, we have high-achieving, high-equitable Canada on our northern border. What have we learned from Canadian reforms? Zero. So there's a bizarre insularity that happens, and boy, has this ever increased in the last months. Everybody's jumping back into their foxholes now. We're going back to our nationalist fortresses. Not helpful for a globalizing world where there's more movement of people and ideas and technologies than ever before. And finally, the old imperative that has had such an impact on students and their learning has been the instrumental imperative. We invest in our kids so that they'll be good knowledge workers of the future. The broader human purposes of education, being a good citizen, being a good neighbor, caring about your planet, these have all been pushed into the background. Are you all with me on these points? You understand? Okay, I know I'm speaking to the converted here. I said after Andy spoke, I turned to a colleague and I said, this is like going to church. And it doesn't really matter how many times you've heard it, because I've heard Andy speak about professional capital many times. You still end up feeling great, right? And you have to hear these messages again because there's so much in the culture that says that these ideas are problematic. Anyway, how can we get past these old imperatives? Well, we got to get better at looking at evidence, all kinds of evidence, not just student achievement data. How long are people living in our society? What's the nature of their access to health care? We need to look broadly at how well people are doing. And then, whatever is being pushed out from the imperial center, we better get good at interpreting it in our own context, because it's incomplete information if we don't bring our moral values to bear. Beyond prescription, there is the promise of a humanistic professionalism, one where we care for our students, we know how to look after ourselves, we look after our planet. And then beyond the insular imperative, there is a global imperative. How do we care about humanity as a whole? And if there's anything that keeps me coming back to working with Education International time after time after time, is we have to overcome the curse of xenophobia and nationalism and understand what the cellist Pablo Casals said so beautifully: love of the country is a beautiful thing, but why does the love have to stop at the border? Beautiful quote. And then finally, beyond the instrumental imperative, if we can help our young people to find purpose and meaning in their lives, and you can't just tell somebody what their purpose and meaning should be. You have to help them to find that. So can we build that part of the human condition back into our education? Now, if my hypothesis is right with this, the old imperatives have led us to one goal: testing for fidelity. You're just testing that system, and you kind of treat the whole thing as a fine-oiled machine. If we're able to pursue these new imperatives, we'll be getting to something much finer. We'll be getting high results on student learning, broadly constructed, and we'll be doing it with complete integrity, so that when you go to your heavenly reward, we won't talk about the other place. When you go to your heavenly reward, you'll be able to say, I did my very best by my kids. I struggled, I faltered, I had problems from time to time, but I'll tell you what, I was always bringing my core moral purposes into the profession. Can we do these things? Well, let me just quickly go through each one of these. So this ideological imperative started off in Chile and Latin America under the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. It was an American imperial import. Okay, neoliberal models applied to education. They gave Chile the most unequal education system in Latin America in the world today. This was all programmatized by Margaret Thatcher in the UK under the National Reform Act of Education, spread like wildfire to the United States, where charter schools began taking over, transforming the educational landscape. In some Australian states, like Western Australia, these ideas have been applied, and even social democratic Sweden, which you would think might have known better, found itself caught up with the excitement of market ideology being applied to education. Now Liberia has turned over its whole public education system to a private provider, and the same ideas have been spreading broadly to India and to China, and even Singapore, though it has a strong public education system. 80% of the kids in Singapore go to shadow schools in the afternoon. So they also have a thriving private education sector. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with private education sector, but the question is, what is the role of the private sector in lifting performance for the system as a whole? In general, the data tells us there is no role. And the OECD has been very clear on this. If you want to lift your performance as a whole, don't use markets. And the pressure on accountability in the system has led educators to burnout, demoralization, opting out of the profession. I have so many wonderful educators in my life who have left the profession because of these pressures, and there's been an excessive onus placed on testing and testing results under these old imperatives. So we got to move beyond this. How are we going to do this? In my book, The New Imperatives, I describe a lot how Germany looked at the reforms that were coming out of the United States and England, but tried to do some things differently. So you have Teach for America in the US, which basically replaces classroom teachers with unprepared teachers. But Teach for Germany, you prepare teachers' aides. Okay? You make sure that your teachers are very highly paid. You make sure that they have the equivalent of 2 master's degrees. Okay? You introduce some testing, grades 3 and 6, but it's optional whether you want to do German or math or both. And it's no-stakes testing. It's testing for diagnostic purposes, not to punish educators, not to stigmatize the children. So, and then Japan also has a strong public education system. Norway, which I just mentioned. And then I'm looking at my little map here. Sorry, I'm having a little hard time seeing. Singapore, of course, has a very strong system of public education. New South Wales in Australia. Kenya and Uganda have been fighting back against Bridge International. I spoke with a couple of colleagues over lunch today who are doing heroic work in that regard. And Canada has also done a fine job of holding off this push towards privatization and markets. So public investment, education for the whole person, and the common good. Can we create educational systems that do these things? And the pressure is on us right now. We're at a tipping point. Okay, we just had a meeting about whether we could build some kind of pedagogical movement throughout Latin America that could resist these trends. Very important, very important. If we don't address these things now, the history of education will look very, very different decades from now. So we have to decide, are we really going to try and uphold these ideas of public education for the common good? Can we pass this on to the next generation, or will education look very, very different? Will we continue to just accept it being pushed out from the imperial center? And it's not just countries in Latin America or Africa or Asia that have been susceptible to these trends. It's also been countries like Australia, or as I mentioned previously, Sweden. So a strong push from imperial centers, but these can be resisted, and they get resisted by educators everywhere. So there's a wonderful group of intrepid educators in Mexico that work with learning communities under a brilliant educator named Gabriel Camara, who wrote this beautiful book, Enseñar y Aprender con Interés, okay? Teaching and learning with interest, allowing students to choose their own freely selected topics, and then tutoring one another and get very, very good at the art of tutoring one another. And if you go into one of these schools and you see all these kids tutoring each other, and then at the end of the day you go into another school and you see teachers tutoring each other, you have a sense of, wow, there's so much power latent in this profession if we can just capitalize on it. And then Yelmer Evers, who is here, has written a glorious book called Flipping the System. Not flipping the system so that technology comes first and the human being comes second. That's happening in many places right now. Flipping the system so the human beings come first and the system serves the human beings instead of the other way around. And then my little book, The Mindful Teacher, which was such a beautiful thing. I got together with beat-up Boston public school teachers. Basically, I had friends in the system who were magnificent award-winning teachers, and they were getting ready to quit. We said, we have to do something to stop this. What can we do? And they said, can we just have Saturday seminars? And then the teachers really came up with the term mindfulness because they knew that they were alienated. They knew that they were estranged from their profession, and they begged for meditation on Saturdays. They said it's the only time that we ever get a chance to stop, to quiet our minds, to relax our bodies, and to focus. So if you're interested in that kind of approach to education, I recommend the Mindful Teacher to you. Now, in a lot of systems everywhere, teachers are under more prescription and under more surveillance than ever before. So in Boston, we call it clipboarding. It's not a nice word. It means a stranger shows up in your classroom with a clipboard, takes detailed notes on what you do, and then disappears. You never get any feedback. You don't do what we do in higher education. If I'm observing a colleague, I sit down first, we talk about the lesson plan, then I observe, then we debrief afterwards. Okay? That doesn't happen. No. There's just a random person shows up in your classroom and observes you for evaluative purposes. This is not going to be how we're going to improve teaching and learning. There have to be other approaches that endeavor to do this. And we're not going to improve teaching and learning just by giving teachers iPads and then putting a webcam in the corner of the classroom so we can see what they're doing, and having a bunch of consultants in Cambridge, Massachusetts, writing their lesson plans for their iPads and having them read that to the kids. And this quote here, by the way, is from an independent report on the Bridge International Academy schools, which was positive. They loved the Bridge International Academy of Schools. And please pay attention to that last sentence there. It's essential. Through standardization and automation, Bridge has streamlined their operations and has largely removed teachers and administrators from the education process altogether. You have removed human judgment entirely from the interaction with the students. Now, you might say, oh, gee, okay, you know, I'm coming here from Switzerland, or I'm Dutch, or I'm Canadian. I don't really have to worry about these things. This is an Apple IIe. Apple IIe was designed for children. When I started writing my doctoral dissertation back in the 1980s, I started on an IBM, and I switched to an Apple IIe. Now I do everything on Apple. It was a massively disruptive technology. And Bridge International Academies could be coming to your country, could be coming to your school, okay? And this is what happens. Clayton Christensen and colleagues have described this, how these disruptive technologies can come in and they disrupt everything. And technology is doing this now, friends. When I got ready to go to my hotel in San Antonio, I'm a member of the Hilton hotel chain, and I got an email that said, great, you're never gonna have to check into a hotel again. You know, just all you have to do is get it on your card here with this app, right? Then when I got to the hotel in San Antonio, I was punching in, you now punch in the elevator floor that you're gonna go to. You get in the elevator, okay, there's no keys, right? Everything is subject to massive disruption. I was talking to a colleague today who's saying, okay, well, we've got these first droids that they're gonna be starting in Dubai. People are gonna start flying across the sky. If you ever liked to look at the sky because it was so peaceful and quiet, enjoy the next few months. There's massive disruption happening everywhere, including in our public schools. So how do we get beyond this? Ooh, we're gonna have to be much smarter. We're gonna have to be much more strategic. We're gonna have to be so much better organized. And here are two books coming from very different perspectives, Professional Capital and the Tullis Studies, that basically, in my reading, agree on the same things. We've got to get really smart. We've got to develop our human capital. We have to develop our social capital, our ability to relate to one another and listen to one another. And then we have to have this decisional capital, this ability to make good judgments. Teaching is complex. Kids are interesting people. They're challenging, right? You got 35, or one colleague said 100 of them in front of you. It's a demanding craft for the very best of us. So if these are the ingredients that have been identified by Andy and Michael Fullen in Professional Capital, let's see what Tullis says. Pretty much the same thing. Professionals need to have a lot of knowledge. They have to know how to work together with their peers. And they also have to know how to make good judgments. So I think that the research is increasingly showing us the way forward as educators. Will we be wise enough to listen to it, to study the research, to act upon it? And can we do this in a methodical way, in a caring way, and pretty damn quickly? Pretty damn quickly, because the other folks are organizing at the speed of lightning. Can we do these things? That's really a historical question that I'm not so sure of. On a good day, I think yes, We can mobilize these forces. That's why I love to come back to the EI office. I feel with like-minded folks. That's why I love to come and work with you all. But on a bad day, it feels like there's just so much momentum. And as you know, we now have a Secretary of Education in the United States does not have a single idea about how to improve education, rather, other than markets. No idea at all. Andy talked about the policy vacuum. Okay, one solution, markets. Okay, and we've lost billions of dollars from our education budget. The only area where funding was increased was for markets. This stuff is for real, folks. They're not playing any games, right? And we're talking about our children and their futures. Now, in Germany, they have this expression, der Mauer im Kopf, the wall in your head. It used to be used to refer to the Berlin Wall, or the wall that separated East and West Germany. And in our minds and in our souls and in our hearts, look at how many countries now are building those walls in their heads. Not just against the 56 million refugees who are out there, the biggest surge since the Second World War, as Andy said, but also in the US, building a wall against Mexico. What's that about? My daughter's godmother lives in Mexico. I'm closer than her than I am to my own brother. Okay? You know, like these very, very close relationships that you form with people across boundary lines. And recently we had a meeting of the American Educational Research Association in San Antonio, Texas. And you know what? You walk around, it's spooky. There's fewer international delegates. This is an insular attitude, the idea that you just withdraw to your own nation. We're not going to be able to do that. We're going to have to do what the Dolores Commission report told us to do. And how can we build real education for the 21st century? So we've got to get good at knowing things, we've got to get good at making things, and we have to learn how to be. How can we be in this world? How can we be without being endlessly acquisitive? How can we be without commoditizing everything? Okay, and that's what I really heard in your critique of what's happening in that one system, Andy, is that mindfulness is getting commoditized. You can commoditize anything. Okay? But still, of course, the question is, how should we be in the world? And then how can we be together? And when the Dolores Commission wrote this report, they said that was the skill we were going to most need for the future, how we can be together. Well, we can draw on international accords like the Declaration and the Convention of the Rights of the Child. They not just say that children have the right to a high-quality education, they also have some things like children have the right to play. The right to play. How many of our schools have actually enshrined that as a right for children? How many of our children know that they have a human right to play? What would we have to do to transform our systems? This is a moral imperative that we need to address. So we have to work with Education International. We have to come to these meetings. We have to traverse our different cultural understandings of what education should be, because we have a global imperative like never before. Never before. This vulnerability that we have right now. And if we can do this, can we do this with meaning? Okay, not just instrumentally, not just where we reduce schools to what Gert Biesta calls learnification, where it's just mechanics, right? And the kids are just memorizing formulas and memorizing vocabulary. No, it has to be education with meaning. So if you want to learn a word in your own language or another language, you have to use it purposefully 10 times. It's not enough just to memorize it. You have to use it in an original context 10 times. That's what the research tells us. Okay? So we can't just pound away at the kids to memorize. Education has to be purposeful. And meanwhile, our kids are begging us. They're pleading with us not to give up on them. This is from a Canadian educator in a project that I have been working on. Don't give up on us. Even though we aren't always easy and we know your jobs are really hard, please don't give up on us. That's not a plea for just more factual information. That's a plea for a human connection. Can we give this to our young people? So, I love this book. It's Primo Levi, Se questo è un uomo, If This Be a Man. It's his recollections of his time spent in the Auschwitz concentration camp. And one day, Primo Levi was told to go get lunch for the other inmates. And a young Alsatian inmate asked him to teach him some Italian. Now, at that point in Levi's internment, he hadn't been speaking Italian to anyone because most of the Italian inmates had died. So he was left with German and he was left with Polish. And he tried to remember something that his teachers had taught him in school. His teachers taught him some lines from Dante's Inferno. And they go like this: Considerate la vostra semanza, Fatti non foste a vivere come brute, ma per seguir virtute e conscienza, which means consider from what noble seed you spring. You are created not to live like beasts, but for the pursuit of virtue and knowledge. And when Primo Levi is able to remember those lines, he says, it was like a trumpet blast. It was like the voice of God. For a moment, I forgot where I was and what had been done to me. Educators, dear friends, let's not forget to give our children poetry. Let's not forget to give our children music. Let's not forget to introduce them to the biggest ideas that human beings know how to imagine about a better future. And you might think, well, okay, that's kind of an interesting historical artifact. That's okay. Does this have any meaning for people today? So I was walking around in the island of San Michele outside of Venice, and I came across this tombstone. The gentleman had put a picture of himself on there. Fatti non foste a vivere come brute, ma per seguir virtute e conoscenza. You were not made to live like beasts, but for the pursuit of virtue and knowledge. Why does somebody put something like that on their tombstone? Okay, it's about a call to dignity. It's about a call to remind us that we are not born to be the slaves of anyone or any particular system. Can we teach such poetry to our students today? Can we do that? And they will face adversity in their lives. Hopefully it won't be adversity like Primo Levi faced, but other forms of adversity. So this is a picture of my wife and me. It was caught by the Boston Globe after President Trump did the executive ban on folks coming into the United States from Muslim countries. I was proud to go at this demonstration. The signs were made by my daughter. My grandmother was an immigrant. She came to the United States as an orphan. Her mother had died in Ireland. Her father moved to Canada. He shortly died of pneumonia. And there was a minister from Buffalo, New York, who saw the situation of this orphan basically being raised by some slightly older brothers and sisters. Now, in those days, there was no border between the United States and Canada, so she just came down and moved. But my mother used to tell me with tears in her eyes the wonderful lines from Emma Lazarus' New Colossus about the Statue of Liberty. Gee, I get choked up now thinking about it. I'm so glad my mother passed away, you know, so that she doesn't have to live in this age now where we turn aside refugees, where we treat outsiders like they're some kind of monsters. We have to reverse these trends, friends. We have to do this. And it's especially acute in the United States, but it's in many countries. So how can we do that? We're going to have to get good at studying evidence, and we're going to have to get good at interpreting it, not according to just old metrics, but to our deepest imaginings about what a future could mean. We're going to have to get better at supporting our profession, our beleaguered profession, which is under threat from so many corners today. We have to remember, you can have some good criticisms of the public school system for sure, but let's not be so merciless that we rip apart the foundation of our very lives and our very cultures. And we have to understand we live in one planet in which we're all deeply interconnected with one another. I'm not sure where my suit came from. I don't know who prepared the food that I ate today. I'm not sure who made the glasses that I'm wearing, but I do know that I am caught up in this inextricable network of mutuality, Martin Luther King called it. And I cannot extricate myself from that without denying my own very humanity. And can we help our young people to discover that life is much more than making money? It's about finding beauty. It's about finding purpose. It's about developing friendships. It's about being in love. And it's about suffering also from time to time. That's part of what it is to be a human being. Can we do those different things? I think we can. I think we can rediscover the grandeur of education. That's from a blog that I did. And I think we can do all these things collectively. We can rediscover its grandeur. We can nourish our collective sense of responsibility for a rising generation. We can promote teaching that just sparkles with creativity to help all of our young people to thrive. And we can traverse the terrain of school improvement by learning from others. And we have to do that in ways that just hones and polishes that professionalism and just makes it so scintillating that anyone would want to send their kids to our school, because we've been learning by studying, by being in conversation with our colleagues, and by learning from the best practices of our colleagues from all over the world. I don't know if we can do all of these things. I hope we can do them in a mindful, caring, and thoughtful way. I hope that you hear my appeal to all of us to do our very best so that we leave a legacy in the footprints of the sand and time that is positive. And there's one thing you cannot do. You cannot not leave a legacy. You're touching other lives. So please, let's make sure that we leave the very finest legacy that we can. Thank you so much for your time. Okay, went a little over, sorry.
That's all right. Thank you very much, Dennis. So I'm going to now turn the floor over to my much younger and better looking and smarter sister, Haldis Holst, who will now take us into a panel. Dennis, if you could stay, we're going to dig a little bit deeper on some of these ideas, but I'm not going to take any words from Haldis, so over to you, my friend.
Thank you, David. Those were great words. That much younger doesn't really work, but all the other stuff I like. May I invite some other panelists up here? We have Maggie, Asibi, Beatrice. Come up and join Dennis and I up here. They're coming.
Here, this way.
You know what? While the ladies are coming up on the podium, Dennis, when I first saw the title of this session, it dawned on me, where does it come from? Of course it comes from Dennis, Shirley.
Where are you
Of
gonna
course
sit?
it's connected to the speech intervention you just held. And then because I started thinking, where has EI defined integrity? Has EI written anything about what we mean with teaching integrity? What is integrity in education? And I really can't recall that we have it anywhere. So I think you, Dennis, have put something on the table here. Now, listening to you, you begin to build a concept of your ideas of integrity. But I'd like to, all of us, reflect a bit. What do we think of? And I'm going to ask our other panelists, what are their first ideas? Because it can be what you started with, Dennis, the ethical approach, the being right, being able to say what is right, what is wrong, the moral aspect of it. We can look at our professional ethics and say that's the basis for our integrity as a profession and what we teach. And we see a lot going on with the cheating. How do people get pressured into corners where they feel that they have to corrupt themselves? We call it corruption in education, that you even can buy degrees online, that people are so pressured to move forward in life that they're corrupting themselves. But you can also look at it from what I feel that you do, from a perspective of creating a greater wholeness, of creating a completeness, of perhaps having it connected to what I was at the workshop earlier about a whole child approach, about educating the whole child, or how we speak about in human rights education, a whole school approach. That is about seeing how everything is connected in everything and how you are part of a greater whole and have to act according to that. But there is some distance between the cheating on the test and sort of taking on that big responsibility. So let me start with integrity. I'll come back to inclusion. We have Beatrice here from Chile. We heard what Dennis said about Chile.
Yeah, he left us.
You know, I think you said the country in Latin America with the greatest inequality.
Policies in education, you see.
So, and just saying, we have Asibi is not on your list, but Asibi is our chief regional coordinator in Africa, and she's going to be able to say something from the overall perspective of Africa, how she sees it. And then we have Maggie. Maggie is from Quebec. She's a real-life classroom teacher, like many of us are, but she's actually been in the classroom every day, which I haven't been for a long time, but I am a teacher. So you can, the contrast in the perspectives here from a more academic, from a teacher-trainer perspective, as Beatrice can give, from the trade union perspective, as Asibi can give, and then we have the classroom perspective. Beatrice, what are your first thoughts about what integrity is?
Well, I was sent the question and I wondered, what am I going to say about integrity? Because the first thing that comes to mind is what you just said, wholeness, completeness. But we can also take it, when we refer to people, to persons, as an attitude of sincerity, of honesty, of being what one is called to be. And then I sort of went back and looked at education. And in this last sense, I think that integrity has to do with all the educational elements coming together in order to contribute to others, children, young people, becoming what they are able and can and are called to be in terms of capacities, in terms of interests, but also in line with where they are situated and what are their limitations also of a personal or a social nature. So in a way, it's a lot of things in one word, I'd say.
Thank you. And this, you brought the big picture there. I want to skip CB. I'm going to come back to you. I want to go over to Maggie to sort of get it from the teacher, trainer, academic perspective to the practitioner. I have to confess to you, I've said to Maggie that she speaks to my heart or her experience. It's sort of, it almost made me emotional. Because I started my teacher career in a small fishing village in the north of Norway, you know, that wonderful social democratic country, Dennis. Quite isolated, based in the area of the country where the indigenous population lives. I saw the wrongness that had been done to the indigenous people of Norway, the Sami people. Being sent away to boarding school, not being allowed to be educated in their own language, being separated from their parents, being deprived of their culture and their belonging, because of a country and a state that believed that they had to be like the majority. They had to be like someone else and not who they were. Now, that's, if I have read it correctly, Maggie, that's equivalent to the community you have been a teacher in. In the north of Quebec, is quite as far north as you can get, with a lot of indigenous people,
Yes,
the
yes.
great majority. What would you say integrity is?
Again, I think it's a huge question to consider. My academic training or background was mainly in social justice and equity, so when I'm thinking of integrity, it's rooted in those values and trying to always critically understand power differences. As a teacher, in an attempt to teach integrity, which is a big challenge, but I think we start initially with with your head, with your critical analytical skills. How can kids learn, young people learn to recognize power imbalances around them? And also, how can we develop their hearts so that they have empathy enough to care about those power imbalances? And as well, to have the courage to stand up to it. I think it is not full integrity until you challenge the issue in front of you. And as we know, there's so many systemic, well-rooted, structural imbalances out there that we as adults have failed to deconstruct and take down for decades. So in teaching our kids to be courageous, to be full of integrity, to challenge these power imbalances, we also must be compassionate and supportive with them, because they probably will in some ways fail and fall down. But to have that perseverance to keep going and trying. In my schools, sometimes that looks as simple as a program I call Acts of Kindness. We have incredible food insecurity in the communities I work at. Nearly 70% of the indigenous youth I work with are food insecure. So I created opportunities for my students to create healthy snacks at the school and serve them to their fellow students. This was a way for them to challenge inequity around them. It also made them feel great, made them feel of service, and it helped develop a sense of community spirit within themselves.
Thank you. I'm going to move along here because Asibi is going to speak French, and my French isn't good enough yet to do it without a headset. But Asibi, from seeing it from your big African perspective, what was your first reaction to what is integrity in education there?
Merci. Nous dirons que j'espère que chacun a un casque et que ça passe, la traduction. L'intégrité est d'abord une valeur essentielle de la culture africaine. Ainsi, elle se traduit même dans les programmes d'enseignement, dans les programmes de la formation des enseignants par ce que nous avons appelé la déontologie, l'éthique professionnelle, qui était un des cours principaux de la formation. Et pour nous syndicalistes, comme représentants des syndicats d'enseignants, l'intégrité fait référence d'abord à nos obligations et aussi à nos droits. Être intègre, pour nous, c'est d'abord pouvoir choisir librement ce que nous devons faire, être fidèle aussi aux programmes qui sont donnés à appliquer. Et comme enseignant également et représentant d'enseignants syndicalistes, nous avons par rapport à cette éthique professionnelle un code de déontologie développé par l'International de l'éducation. Et nous vulgarisons ce code parce que c'est par cette intégrité, par ce code, le respect de ce code, que nous arrivons à établir la confiance entre les élèves, les apprenants, les parents et l'enseignant. Et je dirais aussi que c'est assez important pour nous parce que c'est le manque de confiance. On a toujours considéré l'enseignant comme un substitut parental. Tant que l'intégrité, cette valeur n'est pas respectée, tant que le code de déontologie professionnelle n'est pas respecté, les parents ont tendance à envoyer les enfants vers les écoles privées, la privatisation dont nous avons parlé. C'est pourquoi cette valeur est assez importante, non seulement en Afrique, mais je crois que c'est pour tout le monde. Et pour l'Afrique, l'Union africaine a intégré dans sa vision 2063 et dans sa stratégie continentale pour l'éducation en Afrique, le retour aux valeurs culturelles africaines. Donc l'école nouvelle africaine doit s'appuyer sur les valeurs, sur entre autres l'intégrité. Je vous remercie.
Thanks a lot, Asibi. It's very interesting. Have we got it, Dennis?
I believe. Am I on? Can you hear me? Yeah. So I think that raises really interesting issues of cultural integrity and cultural identity. In some countries, there has been an affliction and an imposition of external systems that have really done violence to the culture. We have to understand that, and I would want to underline what you said there, Maggie. We have to talk about these things. We have to identify these things. And in other contexts, maybe there's good work to build on, and that there is a certain level of confidence so that integrity, the cultural integrity, can be recovered. So I think that these are really important, that we take apart these different levels of intervention that we can do as educators, as an individual teacher can do with the acts of kindness, and the responsiveness to where the children are actually coming from, which I love the example of the climbing wall also, is kind of, if it helps the kids to move, let them move. And then when they come back, they'll be ready to do that. But I could tell you another story, so from another context, where a teacher almost felt like it was a criminal act just to let a child go out and run around the field, right? And so these are the struggles that we have in the profession, I think, over definitions of integrity. Look, really simply for me, this is my plea. Can we do this in education? Can we do this one thing, just one thing? Can we create the space in our schools to talk about our values? Can we create the space in our schools to talk about caring for our students in the right way? If we could just recover that space, which has been lost in so many schools, that would be an enormous achievement. And it doesn't mean that we have to agree with each other, but that means that we create a space for these kinds of conversations for every teacher. And so especially when those young teachers come into the school, they think, wow, I love this place. We really want to connect with the kids. We want to pass on the best knowledge that we know how to do it, and we want to do it in a caring and a loving and a collective way. If we could create space within the schools again, that would be an enormous achievement.
And that sort of brings us over, because I think you're now very good, and all of you, of connecting. Integrity is connected to inclusion, because it is about including the individual, but also seeing the diversity that is the result of respecting each and every student. And that brings us to the integrity and promoting inclusion at the same time. We've spoken a lot today about the threat of privatization, the threat of standardization that sort of leads to a narrow curriculum, that leads to quick fixes, where you can make money off and so on. What we haven't touched that much, but you did touch it, Dennis, was I think what we've had, what I said, the dilemma in education since education started. Very many countries, it was started by religious groups, by the church, by the mosque, whatever, because you had to learn your religion. And this is, you touch on values. It's about not just my values, but other people's values, and this of using education to promote something specific, whether it is specific belief, a political opinion, or whatever, that you may also have forces that are trying to narrow and standardize education, not for an economic motive, but for a power motive and for a motive of belief. So for me, inclusion is not only about including every individual, it's also about content. An inclusive content that is broad, that creates an education system where we can manage perhaps to motivate all parents to feel safe, even if their child may meet something that's different from what they meet at home. I do think we have areas in the world where they're trying to create a notion that education can be value-free, that you can have a neutral transmission of knowledge. I do not believe it. I don't know what you guys believe. But what do you see are the major obstacles to creating this great picture of education with inclusion, with integrity, that can reach all children? I think you, Beatrice, in an interview, you said that about teacher training, that you said that teacher training should ceaselessly foster an attitude of openness to differences and using examples from the world they may come from. For me, that is training teachers in how to have an inclusive education. Am I right?
Well, I think so, but I think it isn't easy. I do quite a lot of work. I've been doing quite a lot of work with new teachers, with teachers that they've just finished their training, and they're coming into the schools, and they come into schools that are very diverse from the experiences that they had when they were preparing to be teachers. And maybe, and their first instinct in those first 2 years is to blame their teacher education for not preparing them for all these diverse contexts. And I think in a way it's true, but it also isn't true, because I think it's very difficult for teacher education programs to prepare for every possible complex situation in which new teachers can find themselves. And in that sense, I came across it the other day. I was talking to somebody who heard it, I just don't remember exactly, that maybe when we are preparing in terms of practicum, in terms of practical experiences, what we are doing is giving them sort of certain tools to perform the rituals of the class instead of giving them tools to observe. And one of the great things that you do need when you have a variety of children and youngsters is to observe differences, to hear the differences, to be attentive, to let the kid climb up the wall if necessary. It may not be necessary. And I think teacher education doesn't do that sufficiently, which is, we talk about reflection, but it's more than that. It's looking and being observant of differences rather than, I'm not saying not do it, rather than preparing the perfect classroom script and going through it in the perfect way that the supervisor, teacher expects from the teacher that is being in preparation. So I'd say learn to look.
I think that's beautiful. This is sort of about putting the focus on, as a teacher, you observe the child, the student first, and then you determine where to go. So it's not necessarily prepared yesterday at home before you met the student. And that is what I think I once learned, that we often in English call adaptive learning too, because it's about seeing the student. Are you able to do adaptive teaching and learning in the community you are in, Maggie?
I think I constantly have to adapt because I'm a foreigner, I'm a non-Indigenous teacher in that community. So I'm, even though I'm within the borders of Canada, I'm constantly facing a cross-cultural challenge every day. But in terms of barriers that I face in teaching kids about integrity or inclusion, is that the students that I teach, which again are Inuit or Indigenous students in Canada, they are every day facing so much exclusion, marginalization, and de-integration. They are just absolutely on the margins of society so much that so much of their dignity is taken away, that it's a real challenge to know where to start in terms of how do you teach integrity or inclusion. What I mean is that in the north where I teach, we have tremendous rates of overcrowding in our housing system. Most of my students will sleep on their living room floor. They'll come to school barely well rested. We have 70% food insecurity. Over 50% of girls experience sexual assault. There's been a tremendous loss of culture. There's a lot of traumas that my students have lived through. I myself witnessed 10 suicides in a span of just 2 years in a community of 1,400 people. Those were all 10 hard losses for me to say goodbye to, but for my students, that was probably the 20th or the 25th person they had lost in their lifespan. So I think a challenge for me in teaching inclusion or integrity is knowing that as my students walk into my classroom, they're bringing a lot of baggage. And sometimes the traumas that they've been through result in what we might call sort of maladaptive social skills. They might be prone to being impulsive or being quite frustrated. They might act out impulsively. They might be bullies themselves as they're dealing with all the confusion and marginalization within their own lives. So I think what I try to draw upon is the value within teaching, that it is relational. I try to really connect with that student, and through creating opportunities for them to build self-confidence, to contribute to their community, so where they go from being disenfranchised through project-based learning to have a chance to contribute, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in the school, hopefully to the community. They really start to heal themselves, and then they become so much more integrated. And then at that point, I think you can think of sort of broader dreams and hopes of integrity that they can that they can further on with their lives. But I think at some point we also need to address personal healing depending upon the context that the student has lived through.
Really, I love that you brought the word dignity into the conversation, and it's sort of, because it makes me think that how can we expect our students to respect others if they don't respect themselves?
And this is such a timely example. I think there's many Canadians in the room, and if you were recently aware, listening to some Canadian news, we can also talk about the integrity of our provincial education system, because Quebec has recently introduced or launched a new history program, and they consulted with my Inuit school board on this, and my Inuit school board gave them at least 10 recommendations and supports on how to make sure that their history program included Indigenous perspectives. And unfortunately, none of those recommendations have made it to the curriculum. So here we see a lack of integrity coming from the structures above these students again. So it is quite challenging.
CB.
Oui, Madame la secrétaire générale adjointe, je crois que le problème d'intégrité et d'inclusion sont intimement liés. Et quand on parle d'inclusion, il faut d'abord partir sur le fait que l'éducation est un droit fondamental. Et à ce titre, tous les enfants d'âge scolarisable devaient avoir ce droit. Et je dirais que l'inclusion ne concerne pas, disons, une catégorie spéciale. Nous oublions souvent les femmes, les filles en Afrique, où dans certains pays, on trouve jusqu'à plus de 90% de filles non scolarisées, et où elles accèdent aux classes les premières années, mais les maintenir à l'école pour qu'elles achèvent leur cursus, c'est un autre défi. Donc, il y a ce groupe qui est un groupe pas indigène, mais défavorisé. À côté de cela, nous avons aussi les enfants ou les apprenants avec des handicaps. Comment les inclure? Il faut penser à plusieurs stratégies. Nous avons aussi et surtout actuellement intégrité et tolérance, respect, le vivre ensemble, les enfants déplacés, les enseignants déplacés, à cause des situations de conflit partout en Afrique. Aujourd'hui, quand nous prenons l'Afrique centrale, l'Ouganda est obligé de recueillir les gens de Burundi, de la RDC, la République démocratique du Congo, les déplacés du Nigeria et les élèves qui ont vu Boko Haram égorger leurs enseignants devant eux. Comment ces enfants vont vivre ensemble avec d'autres qui, soi-disant, relèvent de Boko Haram, sont des musulmans ou sont ceci et cela? Au Niger, je peux continuer, au Mali, un peu partout. Mais comme enseignants, nous devons apprendre à vivre avec eux. Comment entretenir ces enfants? Comment les éduquer? Il faut, nous disons toujours, comme du point de vue syndicaliste, nous disons que tout réside dans la formation de l'enseignant. Il faut qu'on apprenne aux enseignants à être sensibles, par exemple, au genre, les violences liées au genre dans les écoles. Il faut que les enseignants soient formés déjà dans les écoles, les institutions de formation. C'est là où ils doivent apprendre la notion de genre. C'est là également où nous devons donner cette notion de tolérance, de vivre ensemble, de vivre en paix à nos enseignants, à nos futurs enseignants, les recycler. Il ne faut plus avoir cette vision, je dirais, un peu caduque, d'enseigner seulement le savoir. Aller apprendre à lire et écrire aux enfants. Il faut une dimension humaine. une double approche. L'approche développement, mais surtout l'approche humaine. Et je pourrais conclure et continuer en disant que quand on parle d'inclusion, il faut immédiatement voir l'exclusion. Et l'exclusion aussi peut être structurelle, venant en ce moment des décideurs des gouvernements. Je veux parler de l'environnement scolaire. D'ailleurs, c'est pourquoi la campagne de l'International de l'éducation a 3 piliers. Il y a les enseignants formés de qualité, l'environnement scolaire, et les ressources, les infrastructures. Quand les enseignants ou les filles ou les enfants vivant avec un handicap doivent étudier dans des établissements où ils n'ont pas de ces infrastructures, les toilettes pour les filles, les rampes de mobilité, ils ne les ont pas. Ça, il s'agit d'une exclusion structurelle. Et c'est le gouvernement qui en est responsable. Nous avons l'exclusion peut-être économique, vous en avez parlé. Les enfants défavorisés, issus de milieux défavorisés. Qu'est-ce qu'on en fait? Il faut pouvoir les intégrer. Il faut qu'ils puissent bénéficier aussi d'une éducation de qualité et de tout. Madame, voilà un peu, mais nous disons avant tout la formation des enseignants. Il faut former, bien former, et former les enseignants à toutes les approches possibles. Qu'ils sachent que demain, ils peuvent avoir affaire aux enfants en situation difficile, d'urgence, de conflit, affaire aux filles, affaire à tout le monde. Merci.
We're getting quite a broad picture that there are a couple of obstacles out there. Do you see even more than this? We have the structural, the financial, the historical. Are there more out there?
Sounded like partly a spiritual integration, which is often neglected. So that's what makes it a profession, right? It's challenging, it's complicated. That's why you need your best minds working on this. Of all of the many-sided things, education is the one with the most sides. So I was just struck, though, listening to the remarks, how another word for inclusion is also integration, isn't it? So there's kind of a quest for wholeness. That's what an integer is, a whole number, right? So the quest for wholeness, there seems to be something that happens, and maybe it's in a time in which our cultures and our ecosystems, our educational systems are all kind of brittle or fragile. And in thinking of inclusion, or if we play with it, integration, there's that quest to recover a certain wholeness, because when some are cut out of the community, however that is defined, it is an act of violence at a certain level. So we really just need to work so much harder at this and better at this, wherever we may be found.
We have a green screen here that tells us that we have 26 minutes left, but I really don't think we have 26 minutes left because we started a little bit late, and if we're going to sort of get into our reception and so on. So I think we're sort of going to go into the last round, but you've already started it. Because our last round was sort of going to be, how can we overcome the obstacles? And I think that's where you were going already, Dennis, and you've touched on the rest of them too. But I'd love to start with you here, Maggie, because you've given some stories of how you've overcome obstacles in the classroom, but also in the community. How you've had what I would say, what I call the whole school approach, is seeing that the school isn't isolated, that what the kids experience at school is connected to what their life is outside school. But what you've done as a professional, do you have other thoughts? Want to give us other examples?
I think one way I'll try to describe it just quickly as a way to remember is I try to avoid teaching to or teaching for my students, or even teaching at them, but as much as possible teaching with them. And I think that allows most of my work to be so much more sustainable, because the students are so involved. With me, again, I do work, I'm quite privileged because I work with the most at-risk students in my community, but because nobody else wants to handle them, they just let me do whatever I want. So I don't need to stay in the classroom. I have a lot of freedom to do project-based learning and to integrate myself as much into the community as possible. But I have definitely found that to be a solution. I think a second solution is to also be so patient and understand the historical contexts which have created your current situation, and don't always expect as much as we want an answer like this, but that it can take some time, and that small steps are beautiful and needed and inspiring. So that's what I've been learning so far.
Sounds so great, but that certainly wouldn't work if you had to work from an iPad script and you had to do what the iPad had developed a long time ago?
I think if I worked from an iPad script, no students would show up in my class because they would just be so disengaged. I already work in a community with roughly a 85% dropout rate. So we have to be particularly engaging and motivating and youth-friendly, etc., to connect with the kids. So if I was a robot, they might come and laugh at me for a day or two, but I think they'd get bored far too quick. So they really need that human component to engage with. We all do.
Great, thank you. CB, you said something about the necessity of training teachers, that was one of the way of overcoming some of the obstacles. You talked about finances. What else do you need?
Il y a beaucoup d'autres choses. Nous avons, je crois que peut-être que ce que nous avons ignoré, j'ai parlé de la formation, la qualité des enseignants, qui est la ressource essentielle, l'environnement qui doit être sécurisant, sain. Là également, je fais, par exemple, référence à ces filles du Nigeria qui ont été enlevées parce que l'environnement n'est pas sain. Et aussi les violences, il faut ces environnements. Mais il y a la ressource essentielle, les curricula, les programmes, pour qu'il y ait une bonne intégration, pour qu'il y ait le respect de l'intégrité aussi doit pouvoir se référer aux programmes scolaires qui doivent être adaptés et conçus ensemble, non seulement par l'État, le gouverneur, le décideur, par les formateurs que vous êtes, mais aussi par l'ensemble des acteurs de cette éducation et surtout des enseignants, des représentants des enseignants. Donc, les programmes sont aussi importants dans l'inclusion. Et des programmes peuvent faire même pour qu'il y ait des abandons scolaires. Je ne vais pas vous donner des exemples concrets. Il y a une autre chose aussi à laquelle on ne pense pas souvent, c'est la langue d'enseignement. Il faudrait qu'on puisse revoir les langues. Nous disons les langues pas maternelles, les langues d'apprentissage. Déjà, les premières années scolaires doivent être des années où l'apprenant utilise ces langues. C'est plus facile pour qu'il s'adapte d'abord avant d'aborder, surtout chez nous dans les pays africains où nous sommes obligés d'adopter les langues de colonisation comme nos langues de travail. Le français, pour certains, colonisé par la France, la Belgique, et l'anglais par ceux qui ont été colonisés, alors que nous utilisons nos langues maternelles à la maison. Madame, merci.
Beatrice, what is your perspective of how are we going to get over all these obstacles?
Well, I was thinking of teachers and of myself in my days of teaching. It's not easy to it's not easy to work with inclusion. I just want to say it is especially when you have common goals that you need to achieve, especially when we talked about all the standardization processes that lie over teachers. So there's a desperation, in a way, to try and achieve what is expected of me as a teacher. But I have been working a lot recently in case studies with teachers and how they collaborate or work with one another. And perhaps that is one way of easing the difficulties of inclusion. Because inclusion may mean helping a child that is having difficulties in learning, but it also may mean dealing with a disruptive kid. Or the kid that comes in with a gun in the schools. I mean, that's happening in some of our schools in Chile. And how do I deal with this? And there's no way that I can sit and just think about myself on my own, trying to overcome this. And teachers do talk to each other. But maybe we need to encourage and create the environment where this talk, this interchange, this solution that one has and works might not be passed on to do in this exact way, but as an example of how it can happen. Just one little example. I was working in a school where in Chile we have now, fortunately, help for dealing with the children that have disabilities of different sorts. But one of the teachers who had to do this help had to work in secondary schools and in math and assisting kids with learning math. But she didn't know the math program very well. And she went and spoke to the teacher. And the math teacher was willing to help. How do I deal, in this case, with this problem? So I think collaboration is something that we have to push very, very strongly. And also, I think the policies need to allow for collaboration and not force collaboration, because collaboration can be forced from the top downwards, or it can surge, let's say, move upwards and create an atmosphere of collaboration. But that would be one way I would face it.
I sort of hear a bottom-up driven
A
professional
bottom-up,
community.
yes, way and talking to each other, because teachers, we talk all the time to each other, but we can talk in one way and we can talk in another way. And I think instinctively teachers are collaborative, and we can help them and assist them to be more, even so, collaborative.
Dennis?
Yes?
Yes. Do you have any more ideas on how we're going to overcome the obstacles?
So, Karl Marx wrote an essay called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, and he basically asked, how is it possible that a clown like Louis Napoleon becomes the leader of a country as enlightened in many ways as France? And the answer that he came up with was that France at that time still had individual peasants working on individual plots of land. And they did not see the social import of their work. And I think this is very relevant for teachers also. And maybe in a society where more and more people start to feel atomized and isolated from each other, the collegiality is essential. And if it can be loving, but also critical collegiality, where we say to each other things like, you know, you called on the same 3 students, and there's students in the back who are ignored. Or, you know, you seem to speak rather sharply, or you don't offer much encouragement. I counted 5 words of encouragement and 20 words of criticism, those kinds of feedback. So we have to really work on this collegial piece, and then I hope give teachers a sense of time so they can also look back at their best practices. In many systems we brought in very toxic reforms. Can we go back and recover some things that were good, that we used to do, but we stopped doing, and project towards the future? And then can we help people to develop so that they're getting better and better throughout their careers? Because when you first start teaching, it's completely overwhelming, and it's about setting up systems of regularity. Now, in our schools also, we have kids coming coming to school with guns. And then we have to think about how do we respond to that. In a lot of our schools, we've put up security gates and things like that. But of course, there might be other ways to handle those things in terms of creating a high-trust environment in a school. And so those are conversations that we need to have. We're not going to solve these kinds of problems by competing with each other, right? Because if I'm competing with you, then I'm going to withhold information, and you'll withhold it from me. And we'll always view each other with suspicion. So this is why it's really essential we create these strong public school systems with networks of support. I think it's essential that we also step outside of the box, so we learn from our peers, but our colleagues get a chance to come to other meetings and hear from colleagues in other countries. One of the things I got the most from this trip is that my taxi driver yesterday told me that in Holland, I hope this is true, that there's no advertisements for soft drinks between 4 in the afternoon and 7 in the evening. Is that true? Nobody sees them. I was told that it'd be interesting to research that that a lot of kids watch TV in that time, but not so much afterwards. And they want to have kids who are healthy and who are running around and are not overweight. Well, that's a really mindful intervention to make at a societal level, and I think it says to me as an educator that the broader society cares about our young people's well-being. Well, anyway, that's one to research. I hope it's not an urban legend.
Thank you so much, all of you, because what you've done here is to share your experiences, your thought. That's collaborative. That's not isolating yourself. I hope it's been food for thought for all of you, that thoughts is coming around. Talk to each other afterwards. Take it with you tomorrow. Take it home and make sure that we work towards an education system in every country that has integrity, that promotes inclusion, and that brings us forward for a better world. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Feel free. A lot to take in. I want to tell a little short story in my introduction to what's coming next. I don't know exactly how many years ago. He would want me to not say how many. But let's say a few decades ago. It was the height of apartheid. There was a teacher in Holland, Netherlands here, who was teaching geography, elementary school students. One student came up who was new. He was from South Africa. He was an Afrikaner student. And he came up to this particular teacher, and he said, I was just in gym class, and I said I was from South Africa, and I was white Afrikaner. And the gym teacher told everybody in front of me that I came from an evil, horrible country, and that I was coming from the center of all that was wrong in the world. And this little boy had tears in his eyes. And this teacher stopped, and he put him aside. He brought everybody into the classroom, and he put a lesson aside for that day. And he talked about the history of South Africa. He had talked about apartheid. He had talked about the anti-apartheid movement. And he had talked about the way in which people were working together in the streets, resisting it. And he educated. A number of years later, he wouldn't want me to say how many, decades later, he received an email from that same little boy. That little boy was now a lot older. He said, I just wanted to let you know that I went back to South Africa and I became involved at the time of the transition to democracy in terms of the integration, the inclusion, and the reconciliation process in my country. And I think it was pretty recently, the same person I'm about to introduce was at UNESCO giving a keynote speech, and he had the pleasure, actually we were at the UN, weren't we? And he had the pleasure of a not-so-young man come up to him and give him a hug, because that student was with the South African delegation at that time. Ladies and gentlemen, would you warmly welcome the General Secretary of Education International, the teacher I'm talking about, Mr. Fred van Leeuwen. If you read Fred's bio, you basically read the bio of EI. So there's no use in going online to look up Fred's bio, because his bio is our bio, 25 years in running. Fred.
Thank you, David. That's quite an introduction for somebody who's simply going to introduce somebody. Colleagues, it is the very first time that Education International organizes a global conference in the Netherlands. And we are particularly happy that the city of Rotterdam has been kind enough to be our host. This is a very important week for this country and for Rotterdam. Tomorrow evening, May 4th, we remember those who have fallen during the Second World War. This city was hit very, very hard. In fact, this building, I was told, was one of the only 3 buildings in the city center that withstood the bombardment of 1940. On Friday, May 5th, we celebrate the freedom and democratic values that were restored after 5 years of Nazi occupation. The very same values that we believe are core to our task to educate global citizens. This is also an important year for Rotterdam, not only because Feyenoord is about to become this Sunday national first division soccer champion, but also because Rotterdam is, in 2017, Education City of the Netherlands. We are very happy to have with us this afternoon the person who has been responsible for the city's education policies and programs since 2010, Deputy Mayor of Rotterdam, Mr. Hugo de Jonge. And colleagues, Hugo is a member of our profession, a primary school teacher by trade, I believe, but elevated in 2004 to the Guild of Politicians, which is not always a guarantee for success. But I think that in this case, in his case, we can say that as a teacher, as a school principal, and as a politician, he has shown to be determined to accomplish an important mission, improving education quality for all children of Rotterdam, creating better educational opportunities for them, and creating more professional space for their teachers. It is a real pleasure to present you, Hugo de Jonge. Mr. Deputy Mayor, please.
Thanks for this introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, you have reached the end of the first of 3 conference days, enthralling and informative, but also very intensive days. And I can fully imagine that you are looking forward to the drinks awaiting for you. However, before we slake our thirst, I would like to accept your chair's invitation to say a few words. And this is easy for me because I feel at home in your company. Fred already told you, I have been a teacher myself. I pursued my studies here. I've worked here in this city. And you know how it goes. Once a teacher, always a teacher, even if you no longer stand in front of the class. However, I speak to you here first and foremost as your host. And it's my pleasure to be your host. As the Vice Mayor responsible for education in Rotterdam, I wish you a warm welcome in our city. And I'm proud that you chose Rotterdam as the location for this conference. I had a look at the conference agenda and saw that it includes many interesting meetings. But I hope you will also have the opportunity to see more of the city than this building alone. And what you will discover is a city reinventing itself. Yes, we were hit very hard in World War II. That's true. But today's Rotterdam is a different Rotterdam. Today's Rotterdam is a city with relatively large numbers of young residents, a home to a mix of around 170 nationalities. And that reveals something about the city's culture. The city is characterized by an inspirational mix of people with a lot of potential. Countless young startups, young innovative enterprises. We are a young city, getting younger each year. Each year, more babies are born than the year before in Rotterdam. And let me underline, I've got nothing to do with it. Let's stop that rumor before we started it. It's just a great opportunity for our city. But most of all, it gives us the huge responsibility to help our children to exploit their talents and to make the most out of their lives. This brings me to the theme of your conference, which is a plea at the same time. Let us unite for quality of education and leadership. This call really appeals to me because it fits seamlessly with the ambitions for education in our city. And let me share something personal with you on this subject. When I first became the alderman for education in this city, Rotterdam was facing serious educational disadvantages. On average, our pupils were performing worse than those in the rest of the country. The average level of education was lower. The city council could not accept this. Our great dream was to eradicate these disadvantages. But when we started, I received some sobering reactions. Do you really realize that most of our children are already at a disadvantage when they start at school? Someone asked me. And you can't seriously believe it will be possible for these children to achieve results that even come close to those that are typical in the Netherlands, do you? That was years ago. Together with the schools, the school boards, and especially with teachers, we have made a major investment in education in our city. The results speak for themselves. The average level of education in our city has increased. And we have reached a point where most of the disadvantages has been decimated. And at many levels, pupils of all ages are performing at or even above the national average. And perhaps the greatest achievement of all is that more children are attending school and leave with a qualification. The number of dropouts has fallen dramatically, over 50%. And it is first and foremost our schools and our teachers who receive the credit for these results. The role of our teachers is crucial. They make the difference. They provide their pupils with the possibility of developing into skilled individuals, into promising students, and involved citizens. I believe it's only logical for education policy to focus on teachers. In Rotterdam, it's our ambition to offer teachers the opportunity of continuing their development within their profession by actively involving them in the renewal of education. Andy Hargreaves, one of your inspiring keynote speakers this morning, rightly advocates for investment in human capital, in the collective professional group. And I'm happy to reiterate his words. Teachers are more capable and more effective if they work together, learn from each other, and collectively innovate. And it's quite funny, actually. In the classroom, the teacher cracks down on pupils copying each other, and yet I would encourage teachers to do so. Go ahead and copy one another. Examine each other's approach. Dare to learn from each other. Watch colleagues in the classroom, ask colleagues at other schools about their approach. And that's why this conference is so important and such a fine example. Not only are you observing the class next door, but you also learn how your peers across the borders give shape to education. It's extremely informative and refreshing. In Rotterdam, we heavily invest in increasing the level of professionalism among teachers. For example, by providing grants for teachers. This allows them to follow courses or training sessions, set up joint teaching knowledge networks, or embark on a coaching program. We have developed a course for teachers of excellence to connect good teachers and allow them to involve their colleagues in improving education in Rotterdam. We have incorporated many of these aspects in other incentives in our Rotterdam Education Collective Labor Agreement, which are supplementary provisions to the applicable National Dutch Labor Agreement. There is a reason for this. I cannot stress the importance of teachers enough. Who doesn't remember a couple of teachers that played an important role in their life? Perhaps one of your teachers helped you break a deadlock by having that one conversation with you, or they invested that little bit more in you so that you were finally able to solve that complex sum of on your own. We want to cast off the idea in Rotterdam that being a teacher is first and foremost a tough job, particularly in the major city. I would say the opposite is true. A teacher's job may not be the easiest job, but it's certainly the most rewarding, especially in the major city, especially in a city like Rotterdam. There's nowhere else where you can make such a difference as in a city with a mixed population and with its complex challenges on cultural, on social, and cognitive level. Today's teachers embody the two key concepts of this conference: quality and leadership. Investing in this is a primary task for every government and every school board. We are on the right track in Rotterdam, but we are not there yet. We see that interest in the teaching profession is under pressure. How could we make teachers' job more attractive for young people? Not by making it easier, please not, but by making it more captivating, interesting, and challenging. And how challenging can it be to genuinely help children progress in this society? How uplifting can it be to help the pupils of today develop into involved people with a broad perspective and an open mind? They are worth it, it's their right. And I also believe that teachers can play an important role here. Teachers can spend years engaging in PR for their own job. Become your own ambassador. Demonstrate how wonderful your job is. And don't forget, observe your class. Who displays potential teaching talent? Who will be your ideal successor? Involve teachers in the search for new talent. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted that Education International is working hard to strengthen the position of teachers. And it's commendable that so many experts and inspirational speakers are presenting their vision for this in Rotterdam these few days. Let us use these conference days in Rotterdam to jointly support and strive for better education and effective teachers all over the world. And now, up to your drinks.
All right, so I only need a couple hours for this wrap-up. Is that okay? 2 or 3? 1 o 2 horas. ¿Está bien? ¿Sí? Humberti, ¿estás de acuerdo? Perfecto. Bárbaro. No, we're not going to do that. But what I am going to do is very quickly say something in a wrap-up and then give you the information on how to get to the cocktail reception. We started, colleagues, today, and what a day it was, right? Was this not a great day? Right? This was a great day. We started asking core questions about who are we? What will become of us? And who will decide? And then we started to answer those questions. Who we are as teachers. Who we are as education support professionals. What we know will become of us. What we want to become of our students and our communities. The vision that we have. And the fact that we're not going to wait for some faraway politician or leader to tell us. We're going to proceed until apprehended. We are going to lead our profession. We are going to lead our unions. We are going to lead inside of our communities. But that we're not going to do that from an individual, I know what's best for everybody. We talked about doing it as a collective. We talked about collective autonomy. We talked about collective responsibility. We talked about collaboration, professional capital versus the business capital. We went from that collaboration into communication. How do we get our message out? How do we make ourselves understandable? How do we reach those who have heard all the Asians and isms and turn off as soon as we start talking about them? We had great videos and materials and resources and assets, as Phil said. And we have a discussion and a conversation that's happening. We learned about datification. And then we went out and we shared what we were doing ourselves in our organizations, in our universities, in our classrooms. We learned where in under-resourced areas, it's teachers' unions, universities, and even some NGOs. Coberti's not going to like me saying NGOs, but it's not necessarily a bad word in English, my friend. He's laughing. Have a drink with him afterwards. Are working to upskill teachers who are unqualified in working in rural areas. We had workshops about a pedagogical movement in Latin America that is proactively putting forward an agenda. It's saying no is not a proposal for change. We have a vision of what we want. We had discussions from Scotland where you have a really incredible collaboration and different vision where a union is leading on the professional issues. We had lots of great ed chats. We had Angelo, for those of you, it was the first time that he ever had people wear headphones to hear him, because you usually have to step back because he's so loud. But talk about privatization and commercialization in the campaign that we're running. And Carol was talking about all the wonderful research that's happening with teachers. And those of you who are lucky enough to be in with Mary to hear about the great work she's doing in KwaZulu-Natal, I think all really appreciate the way in which she's moved past and pushed on magical thinking into how do we really create real supports and do that in partnership with unions and communities for students and teachers. It's been a great day. I want to thank you all very much for being a part of it. Look forward to having you back again tomorrow morning, where we have a Nobel Peace Prize winner who is going to talk to you. But now I've got the information you really want, as maybe you don't. I really want to know where the deputy mayor got his shoes. I don't know if anyone else noticed those. So that's the information I really want. So the cocktail reception will be, and I love to say this, in the Saalstall. In the Saalstall? In German, okay. There is a lift in the far corner of the foyer, and the wonderful and talented and dedicated EI staff that have been working throughout the day to help support you and make this happen will be out there to help guide you. They will be needing a drink as much as you will, so please follow them. We have a band of students from a local performing arts school here in Rotterdam called the Code Arts. They're studying their master's degree in music and performing arts. If you go on the app and you hit sort of other event or special events, you can get a bio and see them, but you'll get to hear them pretty soon. We would ask you to please leave your headsets on the tables. We're going to start back at 9 o'clock sharp. Like we said, we've got Kailash joining us in the morning, a very good friend of EI who's very excited to come and speak with you all. And my last is, I just wish you a great evening, and I look forward to seeing you all bright and early tomorrow. Thank you very much.